or in making political modernity possible. So the idea of this course that we are starting today is to underline and rethink the importance of the police in what Mark calls the pacification of modern social orders. So let's jump to the questions. So in your work, Mark, you associate policing with pacification, no? Police is kind of synonymous with pacification. I was hoping, in order to have this like introductory talk, you could explain to us how and why is policing pacification? What does it pacify and how does it pacify it?
Okay. Well, it's a very good first question. It's also quite a big question because you're raising the two major concepts that I'm dealing with at the moment, which is police and pacification. Let me just explain a little bit that I came to the idea of police, as you say, partly through an absence in political science, political theory, of any kind of theorizing about police. And what I started to do many, many years ago now, over 20 years ago, was to try and think about police not through the narrow lens of crime and the uniformed police officers. Obviously, it involves that. But I tried to develop an argument about policing as what I called the fabrication of social order. And by that, what I meant was the ways in which the state organizes, structures, controls, manages, regulates, administers civil society. And it does that not just as if you like, a reactive force, reacting to problems, reacting to what it sees as crimes or forms of disorder. The state does it the state polices as an active process, active in the sense of being productive, if you like. In other words, it's productive of social order, and it's productive of social order in a particular kind of way. And the way I'm interested in is the constitution of capital. How is capitalism created? And so my argument about policing is not, how much do police officers engage with the law? How successful are police officers in stopping crime or solving crimes and so forth? What my interest in policing and the idea of police is really about how the state constitutes and reconstitutes capital over and over again. And of course, that raises questions about class, most centrally, but it also raises questions about race and gender and so forth. Okay, so that touches on the debates that take place within criminology concerning, for example, crime and law, but it also raises much, much bigger questions about what we mean by social order. How is social order constructed? How is it reproduced over and over again? How is it, in one sense, how is it that we put up with so much shit in our lives, right? The policing is central to that kind of constant iteration of misery, of alienation, as well as exploitation. So that was my original argument all those many years ago. Now, more recently, what I've tried to do is I'm now trying to finish a book on the idea of pacification. Because what I'm trying to do is to argue that we need to think of policing as pacification, but also as pacification as central to the process of policing and the way the state polices civil society. Now, what I like about this idea of pacification is it does a number of things. The first thing it does is it draws together the idea of police and the idea of war. Okay, this is captured in the much more recent concept, counterinsurgency. But counterinsurgency is a concept that really only emerges from roughly 1960 onwards, whereas pacification has a much, much longer history, going back to the Romans have this idea, but then in particular, colonial powers used it to talk about their relationship with indigenous peoples, but also the ruling class constantly produced document after document explaining what they're trying to do through this process of pacification. So the first thing it does is it brings together the idea of police and war. And this is important, I think, because too many people have tried to hold these ideas separately, and this focuses their attention on the institutions of policing, the police forces, and the institutions of war, namely the military. And then there's this very banal and very misleading and ideologically very problematic, very loaded separation between police and war. And in one book, War Power, Police Power, I tried to bring them together. And what I like about the idea of pacification is that it really brings policing and the idea of police power and war power together, right? The pacification is both. You can see this, of course, in the most obvious example that we might have time to discuss, the war on drugs. Yeah, that the war on drugs is, yes, it involves institutions that fall under the label military, but of course it's a massive policing operation. And of course there are so many other policing operations that have the label war. We only have to think of, for example, the war on terror. But there's also, of course, the war on crime, which has been going on for hundreds of years and still hasn't been won yet. There's all sorts of other wars that police engage in. And the police institution itself constantly talks about itself as fighting these wars, right? It's constantly using the language of war. So one of the things I like about pacification is it brings together police and war. The other thing I like about it is that there are literally thousands and thousands of documents produced by the state, security intellectuals, pacification theorists, counterinsurgency experts, which give us a body of work which is really quite interesting and fun to get into, right? Where they're trying to talk to us about, trying to tell us about what they mean when they're describing pacification. And what I also like about it is that pacification is not simply a kind of repressive process, right? It's not just about using technologies of violence to put down protests, to put down resistance, to put down struggles. Yes, it involves all of those things. But one of the things that the pacification experts constantly tell us is that they are constantly trying to build a new social order or rebuild the social order. And one of the institutions they say is central to this is the police force, but also the police force in conjunction with a whole range of other institutions, which I'm insisting kind of we need to still think of as policing. So for example, welfare officers or social workers. Okay, so my concept of, so the idea of pacification reinforces a kind of very broad concept of the police power. You're muted. You're muted, Alejandro.
Yes. That's a very important I guess argument in your work, that we tend to think of policing as this force invested in the use of force, but it's much more than that. And you drive a lot from the original concept of policing in order to exemplify how policing transcends the mere use of violence in order to fabricate through violence the social order, So when we think of policing today as a word or as a concept, we obviously associate it with, this institution emerging kind of globally around the 19th century, monopolizing the internal use of force and deploying this force to tackle on criminal activity, But policing as a concept or a semantic has an older history. And I was hoping you can explain to us what policing meant before it came associated with the use of force and law enforcement and anti-crime, particularly in the 19th century, and what policing back then, where does the word police come from?
Sure, sure. Okay, so the concept of police has a long history, which is very, very much connected with the birth and development of the modern state. We find its semantic origins back in the notion of the polis, obviously, and the roots of that as police, but also policy, as well as politics in general. But with the birth of the modern state, what we get is a whole set of institutions and processes which state theorists, police scientists, cameralist theorists described under the label of police. Now, some of this was to do with what they called crime, but we, of course, whenever we mention crime, we should always ask the question of, who is defining what as a crime, and why are certain activities defined as crimes and others not as crime. But it was also involved in a whole range of other activities. So, for example, it's involved in welfare provision, the pricing of commodities on the market, bridge building, street lighting. In particular, it's involved in policing or managing vagrancy or vagabondage. In other words, why are these people idle? Yeah, it's very much concerned with rounding up the masterless men and women that are thrown off from the land with the collapse of feudalism. So it's got a whole range of activities, a whole range of processes, all of which go under the label of police. Centrally, what it's concerned with in all of these activities is the condition of work. Okay, now, if you go back to your first question, I said, well, we need to think about how the state constitutes and reconstitutes capital. What we find with the early police is that its central interest was in the condition of work. In other words, how is it that we make sure that people who should be working are working? And the main way to do that is, of course, to remove any form of subsistence other than the wage. Now, once we start thinking about policing in those terms, how is it that we stop this person begging? How is it that we stop this person living off of the land? How is it that we stop this person wandering from region to region, simply finding ways of living without working for a wage? Then we realize something quite important, which is that the police power historically was central to the making of the working class, right? The creation of a proletariat. And I think that historical origin is really important for when we think about debates about policing now, and ask questions about, how is it that we see uniformed police officers intervene in certain situations and not others? Now, so that's part of its history. What happens? I mean, it's difficult to describe the history in just a few sentences, but what happens in the late 18th century and then into the early 19th century is that you start getting a debate about whether it's possible to professionalize this process. And out of this debate, you get a kind of a liberal insistence that police forces should look in a certain way, right? They should be organized, they should be structured in a certain way, often copying military structures, it should be said. They should be professionalized, they should be uniformed. And they should be concerned with this thing called crime or law and order. Yeah. So you get the development of the professionalization, the professional police forces. And this takes place in different moments during the 19th century, right? It's generally taken to be England that kicks this off in 1829, and then other developed states, industrializing nations tend to follow suit. But what's interesting in this context is that I was going to say despite this professionalization, but you might also say because of it, actually. The police forces themselves never give up their interest in all these other activities. Yeah. So take now, for example, I don't know how true this is of Mexico, but it's certainly true of virtually every Western state, European states, and the US and Canada. You find police officers integrated into schools, right? I don't know if this is the case there, but it's certainly the case here. So they're constantly engaging with teachers in policing school pupils in various ways. You find police officers never give up their interest in, for example, social work or welfare, because of course they know full well that they cannot constantly reproduce social order without these other modes of policing. Yeah. So August Vollmer, for example, the so-called father of American policing, once gave a major paper, and it was reproduced several times, on the policeman as a social worker, right? That's its title. Yeah. In other words, the real job of the police officer is not so much to be stopping crime. The real job of the police officer is to be a social worker, because it's the social worker that is central to the reproduction of a laboring class. Yeah. Now, that does something interesting, I think. What it does is it, I think, forces us to consider those other institutions still through the lens of police. In other words, let's not follow the liberal line and say policing is what takes place through the uniformed professional police force. Let's be a bit more radical and critical and creative and recognize that these other institutions are still involved in policing, because policing is about the production and reproduction of the social order. And of course, you can't produce and reproduce the social order of wage labor without teachers and social workers and welfare officers. Yeah. So that's where I want to hold on to this expansive, broad notion of policing, despite the kind of 19th century professionalization of police forces.
Perfect. So we're discussing this kind of transition. It's not really a transition, because we're discussing how policing as a word kind of meant governance, no? Closely connected to the concept of governmentality and like the regulation of things that obviously transcend, the sole use of violence to enforce a social order, but like through different means. And this meant policing, no? Like for the cameralists, no? The policing meant, government, no? To say it in a way. And then in the 19th century, there are many continuities, between what the police represent and how it overflows other aspects of governance still after the professionalization of the police. But there is this growing concentration of violence, or a growing importance of violence as a function of policing. And this is very much connected to structural, I think, developments taking place in the 19th century. Mexico is I think a good example of this transition that has continuities, but that it tends to be more focused on or explains a little why police became associated with the use of force. So Mexico's first national law enforcement body developed around the mid-19th century and resulted mostly from a rise in insecurity, banditry, vagabonds, social protest generated by Mexico's liberalization process. Mexico's liberalization process was probably the biggest and most profound liberalization process in the global periphery of the 19th century. It turned Mexico into the country with the largest land concentration in Latin America. 98% of the peasantry was left without land. And it was, unsurprisingly, there was, a lot of social chaos, a lot of social discontent, anarchy, protests, organized crime, etc. No? So the government at this hour creates the first policing body of properly or understood as, as a repressive force in the 19th century to repress these different manifestations of social discontent. No, again, putting down peasant protests, putting down worker strikes, handling a rise of criminality, etc. So I was wondering to what extent this Mexican experience, this close relationship between, structure, changes in the structure, changes in the way we organize, our economic activity and production and so on, resonate more globally. With this transition.
Sorry, Alejandro, I lost
an
you.
Agents of violence to, so my question is, to what extent does this Mexican experience reflect, the transition more generally into, into the modern police understood more as a repressive force, and to quell all these kind of like insecurities, as you call them, to secure the insecurities generated by the acceleration of the capitalist process during a liberalization process, for example.
Sure. I lost a little bit of your question there, but I think I've got it. In one sense, this isn't a question about police, and it's not a question about Mexico, right? In one sense, it's a question about the levels of abstraction in which we think, yeah, and the question of specificity, historical specificities in different national contexts, vis-a-vis a theory that tries to operate at a quite an abstract level, yeah, and there will always be national differences. What I find quite striking is a remarkable pattern that you find virtually everywhere I look. I mean, I can't claim comprehensive knowledge of every nation state, but it's quite remarkable the extent to which you get this 19th century professionalization, and simultaneously a kind of constant debate about what is the precise relationship now that we've got this police force between that force, that institution, and all the other institutions that seem to be engaged with it in various ways, and which the police constantly need to keep engaging with for various reasons. Yeah, and it's quite remarkable that that does seem to be the pattern. Okay, and that's what I think is, for me, is it pushes me to kind of continue with this line of argument, which is to say, actually, we do need this concept of police. We do need to think about national differences in the way that you're saying, right? And it's important to be sensitive to all of those, but it's important, I think, to try and pitch an argument about the police power in such a way that it can be kind of operationalized and mobilized in different national contexts. So interestingly, your question began with a comment about governance, and then you started to say governmentality, yeah, and then you slightly hesitated, I think, because you were worried that maybe you were coming to sound too Foucauldian, and you were worried that this would be held against you because this is being videoed, right, and recorded, yeah. But I don't want to have a discussion about governmentality, but if we were to think about that concept, it's pitched at a level of abstraction such that one can always talk about, well, governmentality in 19th century Mexico, right? Governmentality in 20th century Russia, governmentality in 21st century India. You see what I mean, right? It's so for me, the concept of police and the idea of pacification are pitched at that kind of level. That's the kind of level of abstraction that I'm trying to make this argument work on?
Okay, I take that. So one of the things that we think of when we think of the police is that, the police is this body, which implements the law almost verbatim. The police, is in the street. They find themselves in this, in a given situation. They look at their manual, find the relevant legislation, and proceed accordingly. But in reality, most of what the police does, and I think this is very, I think, important to your argument of, where the source of pacification comes from, which is not the law, or not necessarily the law, but there's a big portion of discretion involved in the generation of the social order in its everyday. So the police decides when, how to enforce the law. The idea that police discretion is centerpiece. This is, I think, important to the way you look at policing as well. So I was hoping you could explain a little to us more about this, about why police discretion is so important to the policing project.
Sure. Yeah, okay. So if we think about the police institution now and think about the ways in which it operates, I mean, you're absolutely right that we are constantly told that the police is there to enforce the law, to prevent the law from being broken, and to detect when laws have been broken and to find the people who have broken them. Yeah. But well, the first thing we discover when we look at what police officers do is that rarely is that the case. Okay, and when we look at their operations, for example, on the street, what we find is that they use their discretion. This is, I think, the connection you're trying to get us to talk about in relation to law. They use their discretion to intervene in a particular situation. And what drives them in those situations is not so much, is a law being broken? Has a law been broken? I need to step in and fix it. What drives them is a far vaguer notion, but it's integral to policing, which is disorder, right? Is there something going on here that is disorderly? And the judge of that is myself as the police officer. Okay, and that of course means that police officers can and they will intervene over and over again when it's not at all clear to anyone else watching that a law has been broken. A lot of the time it's not at all clear that there is actually disorder, but there's a decision being made on the discretionary basis of the police officer that they can and will intervene. I mean, the first thing one should note about this, of course, is that it's precisely that discretionary, that exercise of discretionary power that often leads to so many violent confrontations and police brutality and police killings. Yeah. So if you take the police brutality, police killings that we hear about time and again, it's often been the case that police have intervened for no apparent reason, or at least no reason that is apparent to anyone who isn't the police officer on the particular, at that particular moment in that particular place. Yeah. So, and this takes us to the heart of police power, right? Because it takes us to the heart of the encounters that police officers have on the streets. And in particular, it takes us, it opens the door for us to find exactly where police violence is often experienced, and often experienced at its most brutal and crude. And behind that violence is the decision by the police officer that an intervention was necessary. What happens after the event, and it's important to recognize that it is after the event, is that police officers will find a law that they think has been broken. Yeah. At the same time, if they cannot find a specific law that has been broken. For example, possession of drugs. Yeah, in other words, they've no idea that this person has drugs, but they want to stop this person for whatever reason they think is necessary, or they search them, they find the drugs, and then they use the drugs laws as a justification for searching the person in the first instance. Yeah.
In Mexico, we call this cuadrar el delito, which is, a very, common
right.
practice of the police, cuadrar el delito, to kind of like find a way,
Yeah.
the excuse in order to be able to intervene and to
Yeah.
enforce police power.
Yeah. But also, what you also find in again, this is a certain level of abstraction, but I think one could find this virtually in every nation state one looks at. Police also hold in their power laws that are incredibly general and vague. Now, in the UK, that's the vagrancy law. Okay, and the police can use the vagrancy law to intervene in situations on the street more or less at will. Okay, because the vagrancy law opens the door for the police to stop someone and ask them questions about their occupation, their means of subsistence, their mode of living, where they live, and so forth. Yeah, and most police statutes have something like that within them that allows the police to intervene, to find a reason to intervene, even when there's no apparent reason to anyone else. Yeah. And so this gives us something important, right? Because if it takes us back to the previous question you were asking a few minutes ago about the kind of the liberal reconstruction of a professional police force in the 19th century. The myth of that liberal reconstruction is the good liberal state wants a police force where its powers are very specifically defined, circumscribed, managed, controlled, regulated, right? And it's clear at any one time why the police are intervening and the grounds on which they have to do so. Okay, that's the liberal myth, right? The reality of all social orders, right, liberal and more, if like, authoritarian, is precisely the opposite, right? That's exactly what we don't find. We find that police are given these expansive powers to intervene, and it's often grounded in the notion of discretion.
You often quote Mark in that very truthful line when he wrote that liberty is not the supreme concept of bourgeois society or liberal society, but security. And I think that what we're pointing out right now is that neither legality is, the supreme concept of bourgeois society.
Yeah.
It's always security, no?
But absolutely, but your mention of that is precise, is really useful in this context, because the notion of security now is so powerful, and it's provided as the grounds for the state doing whatever it wishes. Now, we find that with ideas around, for example, national security, right? So on the grounds of national security, the good liberal state can imprison people without trial, torture them, summarily execute them, and so forth, right? So, but we also find that operating through everyday police operations, right? The police will find a reason to intervene based on what they describe as a security situation. Yeah, there's nothing for you to do here. Go away. It's a security operation. Turn off that camera. Go home. Yeah. So security. I mean, when Mark says that, I think it's an incredibly profound observation of his. And in one sense, I've spent 20 plus years trying to develop an argument around it. That it's not liberty that is the supreme concept of bourgeois society. It's security. And then he says the concept of police, right? That those two concepts go together: police, security. And this, I think, also is worth thinking about in relation to some of the contemporary debates we're seeing now in the last few years about police abolition. You know, that some of those debates are making arguments for police abolition, and they say what we need to find is alternative forms of security, right? Security from within the community, security from below, you know, democratic security,
community.
Yeah? And yeah, well, exactly. But actually, I think that's a problem, right? Because actually, I think we need to be pushing the argument further and saying, no, let's not argue for police abolition, but try and reconstruct some security apparatuses, right? Because security apparatuses are always, they're either taken away from us or they run away from us, right? You know, in a sense, I want to push the police abolitionist argument further and talk about security abolition, right? And say, well, what does that, what can we take that seriously? What does that mean? And that I think is far more challenging, but in a sense far more interesting, because it raises questions about how we can imagine politics. You know, can we imagine politics not organized around the notion of security?
Yes, I think that by the end of this talk, I'm probably going to ask you, what do you think is like the opposite of policing? But just going a little back to the idea of police discretion and what it tells us about security as kind of like the paramount category of liberal society, not liberty, not legality. I think that, you know, the problematic relationship between policing and legality points to something that I've worked, you know, in my research, that is the relationship between policing and not only illegality, but criminality, you know, something that we see in Mexico a lot. No, I mean, Mexico, it's impossible to distinguish between the police and organized crime, especially now. I don't know if you know, but like the architect of war and drugs in Mexico was recently sentenced on all counts for drugs.
it was covered in the news here as well. As you know, it's you're talking about Luna, yeah. I mean, what's interesting about that is that it got coverage here, but the coverage of such events over in the UK, and I think this is probably true of the US as well, is that this is somehow a surprise, right? That it's unusual. Yeah. And actually, of course, it's not, right? It's just, you know, he was doing it on that, the broadest scale possible. Yeah. But, you know, it's true. You know, if you wanted to buy drugs in the UK, you should go and see a police officer, right?
And you know, and well, one of the things that I've worked and that interest me in, you know, or you know, the angles from where I try to criticize the idea, the notion of policing, is especially in this relationship between policing and organized crime, which is a historical relationship. No, it's like many police organizations in the world developed from, you know, from criminal gangs. No, you know, if you think, for example, of again 19th century Mexico. No, so land liberalization, as I mentioned, triggered this rise in organized crime, all kinds of problems, social protests, etc. No, and these activities, from my perspective, called for for the creation of a police force able to deal with them and pacify them through more violent means than merely kind of like, you know, governance or those lines. No, so the liberal government in the mid 19th century in Mexico created the first national policing body called Los Rurales. And what I find interesting about Los Rurales was that it was a police force created by integrating bandits and amnestied criminals generated by the liberalization process. The liberal government amnestied bandits and incorporates them into this police force, gives them a badge, and allows them to continue to behave like criminals and extort the population as long as they pacify haciendas, break down labor strikes, provide security, to railroads and so on. No?
Yeah.
So to put it, more concisely, I think organized crime operated in many ways as a police. No, this underscores this is underscored, for example, by Anton Bloch. No, as I mentioned in his studies about the Sicilian mafia, where he explained how emerging capitalist classes or interests have little option but to co-opt or instrumentalize, these criminals in order to put down social antagonisms. And even if you think about neoliberalization today in Mexico, many criminal groups in this so-called war on drugs are invested in extractive processes, in enforcing work relations, and providing security to agribusiness, mining projects, evicting people, killing social activists, and so on. So I was, this is kind of like my line in which I try to criticize policing. Policing is supposed to be the antagonist of crime, but it depends on a regular basis on crime to operate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was hoping you could maybe comment on what you think about this.
Sure. I mean, obviously, I feel, slightly uncomfortable talking to Mexicans about the war on drugs, because I imagine you guys know a lot more about it than I do, right? But some of the things you said are interesting, right? Because if you take that notion of the mafia, and Bloch's argument about the mafia, yeah. I mean, so at one level, the story is, look, because this is on one level, right? This is not the story, I think, but this is the story we're told, that because the state wants a monopoly over the means of violence, other forms of organized violence are always a problem and therefore need to be eradicated, right? And so you could go, well, look, so that's why the mafia is a problem for the state. That's why organized drugs cartels are a problem for the state, because they are exercising modes of violence that are not monopolized by the state, right? That's the story on one level. But actually, I think that's not the whole story, right? The story is not that the state finds other claims of violence problematic. The story is the state only finds problematic those organized modes of violence that it cannot manage in some way in relation to its own mechanisms of policing, right? So in other words, this is where the mafia is not a threat to the state, right? It's working in conjunction with various forms of state power, with various offices of state, right? And the drugs cartels are not a threat to the state. They're working in conjunction with various offices of state, right? That's the story of Luna, right? It's like, well, we could just work together on this, yeah. And that's where it becomes far more interesting, because it begs the question of, what crime is, what kinds of activities are being defined by the state as crimes that genuinely need eradicating, or we as the state need to genuinely eradicate, and which kinds of activities are we going to define as crimes, but actually not ever really getting around to eradicating, right? Yeah, in other words, I mean, in a sense, we're now touching on, the idea of the crimes of the powerful, the crimes of organized capitalist groups, the crimes of organized ruling elites, the ruling class, and so forth, and how those crimes often take place through offices of state, but they often take place through all sorts of organizations that are operating at arm's length from the state, but in close collaboration.
So,
Alejandro, we have just 10 more minutes.
So if I may, I will ask one final question, and then maybe we can take questions, or should you just if you have questions, please go ahead. And then maybe I can ask one final question to Mark.
I don't know, Pablo just joined us. I don't know if you want to ask something, Pablo. Pablo is associated professor at 17. If you want to introduce yourself, Pablo, feel free, please.
Hi, hello. Yes, thank you so much, Alejandro, for organizing this. Mark, for joining us here in 17 Instituto de Estudios Críticos. We are really, really happy to have this truly important conversation, as Alejandro have said, no, in the context of Mexico, we really should be paying attention to a critical conversation on security, on police, and everything that entails. I guess, I don't know, Alejandro, if we have some questions from the people that are listening to this conversation. Maybe we could start with that. And then I have 3 elaborate questions. I think maybe I will let you know, Mark, which these 3 questions are, and you can pick only one. I'm not trying here to, monopolize the conversation or put you on the spot or something. But I guess it would be better if we start with what people in the audience have asked us first.
Sure.
You can address, we have 2 questions, and then maybe if Alejandro is so kind to let me maybe ask 1 question, and after that we'll see how it goes.
Sure.
Is that okay with you guys?
Yes, yep.
Perfecto, muy bien, excelente. Bueno, vamos a leer las 2 preguntas del público que nos llegan, me imagino que es por Facebook o YouTube, probablemente por Facebook. No tienen nombre de autor, pero las vamos a leer igual porque son preguntas importantes. So, Mark, here are the first question. Do you want me to read both of them? Or you one and then the other?
Yeah.
I guess I'll read both of them then. So the first question is, in a context of war like in Mexico, how can the police become a peace agent? That will be the first question. And the second question is, it's in Spanish. I'll read it in Spanish and then I'll translate. ¿Cómo se dan la relación entre la policía en el marco de lo planteado por Mark con los militares o las milicias? So the question will be roughly translated. How it's the relation of the police established or created with militaries and militias in the context of what you have just been saying?
Okay. So, in relation to the question about police as a peace agent, the answer is it can't. The answer to the question is it can't, right? It can't be a peace agent because it is constantly fighting wars, okay? What we have to deal with is not how can the police become a peace agent. What we have to deal with is, if you like, the whole ideology of peace and peacekeeping, which underpins police operations, right? Peace is not in my mind, peace is not a particularly useful category here. I don't think it has any critical purchase. I think we need to recognize the police wars that have been taking place for centuries and in which we are often the targets and the victims. Okay, there is no peace with police. The police exists precisely because we are in a condition of war. Yeah. Now, just to kind of push that a little bit more, one of the ideas underpinning the idea of pacification, the concept of pacification, is precisely the idea of peace, right? But pacification comes from the Roman idea of the pax, the peace, yeah? So pacification is a kind of peacification in the sense that it is an imposition of a peace, yeah? But it's the imposition of a peace, right? So the Romans used to talk about a people being pacified when the people had been conquered. Okay, that's still resonates through hundreds of years of colonialism. I can see there's a question about colonialism in there, yeah? So what was happening with the colonial powers was that they would conquer peoples and call this pacification, call this peace, yeah? As you can see, it's also, you know, if you like, pure ideology. But then the question is, well, what does that mean about us? What does that mean about our pacification? Well, our pacification consists in being told that this is our condition of peace. But actually, of course, once you open the door to the idea of policing as war making, then we realize we're not in peace. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mark.
The question about police and military, I'm going to not answer because I wrote a book called War Power, Police Power, which is a fairly long book, where I try and bring the ideas of policing and warring together, right? To push that, to say, let's stop thinking about, oh, is the police becoming militarized? Are the military getting involved in too many policing operations? Let's not have that as our starting point, but let's think about these things together. So I instead of answering the question, I'm just going to say, get a copy of my book. I would say buy one, but you can get it free on the internet, right? You just type in Mark Neocleous, War Power, Police Power, PDF, and those various websites that put up PDFs of books, right? You can get it for free on the internet.
And we have the verbal authorization of Mark, okay? So it's
so I mean, I'm encouraging you to break the copyright laws, right? This is, you know, that's how discussions of policing should probably end, right? Let's go out and break the law by downloading illegal copies of my book.
Hey, Alejandro, I don't know if it's okay with you, but we have another question from
as many as you want, Pablo, please.
Thank you. And I just want to say that I really like your idea that because there is no peace, there has to be police, no? And I think the etymological definition of the word security derives from the Latin sine cura, which means without cure. We need a state of security, and we need a security apparatus because we cannot care for ourselves by ourselves. So there's always an absence of caring and an absence of security that implements the state of security and thus policing. So I guess that's one point with what you just point.
Yeah, so one of the chapters in the pacification book is on the relationship between security and insecurity and their histories and how the histories come together around the modern state. That security originally was actually a negative state, right? Because if you thought of yourself as secure, you were living in some kind of carelessness. And then it becomes a positive condition. And at that point, we get the invention of the concept of insecurity, right? That insecurity is a much more recent idea. And at that point, then the security state can operate with both concepts. Yeah, you're insecure, we will make you secure. And of course, around that, you get a whole security industry, which is also an insecurity industry. And connected to that is the whole problem of death. Because for the early modern security thinkers like Hobbes, the opposite of security wasn't insecurity. Hobbes doesn't have that concept because it's not invented in that period. What he has is the opposite of security is a fear of violent death, right? And that's the story we're constantly told, right? We need the police because otherwise, you will suffer a violent death.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. I guess I'll read Benjamin Myers. He's the founder and director of the Instituto de Estudios Críticos, and he was kind enough to send us a question. So I will just read it to you, and then if there's a little bit more time, maybe Alejandro can say a last word, last question. If there's even more time, I will do a last intervention. But here goes Benjamin Myers' question. He says, thank you all for this important conversation. I'd like to know what your sense of current tendencies in relation to the police and policing are in the current climate of renewed authoritarian impulses worldwide. What is changing? How fast are these changes taking place?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question with 1 minute to go, right? That's a very good question. I think it takes us in very different directions. I mean, the first is, I guess, you know, what is happening to liberal states. You know, what is happening with the rise of certain authoritarian impulses is the phrase that is used, but we could also go further and talk about the emergence of all sorts of well, potentially fascist forces, and you know, to what extent is liberalism willing to give way to its own internal authoritarian impulses, right? To what extent is the liberal state willing to do what it did once historically, which is to essentially jettison some of its key parameters in order to maintain the social order? And I'm a bit torn here, right? Because it's interesting that, you know, historically, liberalism gave way to fascism. You know, fascism emerges from a particular moment in capitalist modernity, in the context of a mass proletarian movement, right? It was you know, fascism was a kind of, if you like, a capitalist and liberal response to the possibility of communism. Okay, I don't see that possibility now. I wish I did, right? But I don't, right? I see various forms of resistance, but they don't seem to have the and various struggles of all sorts of importance, but they don't have the historical weight that, you know, the possibility of communism had from roughly whatever 1917 through to 1922, or yeah. And so it begs the question about kind of what precisely is happening. I know that I'm now throwing the question back, but what precisely is happening as we see these, you know, renewed tendencies? And I don't have an answer to it, unfortunately.
I don't know, Alejandro.
Did you want to end the conversation with me saying I don't have an answer to it?
No. Let's ask him.
Okay, Alejandro.
Okay, Mark. So just to finalize this conversation, and taking a little bit from what you just mentioned in how these social movements, or you know, the criticisms are not going maybe to the core of the problem today, and with respect to, you know, growing policing powers and kind of the solutions that have been put forward. In recent years, as everybody knows, there's been like growing interest in critical policing studies, perhaps especially as a result of growing awareness of police brutality against minorities in places like the US, for example. No, so Black Lives Matter, is perhaps the best known social movement reacting against, you know, the growth of the policing apparatus. And I was hoping to know a little more about your ideas of this raising awareness of the policialization of social life, what, you know, the kind of responses that we're witnessing. For example, one of my concerns is that this criticism is often casted in terms that exclude the concept of class, and that might not go directly to you know, to what policing is really about and its relationship with structure, independently of what kind of people are being targeted by the police. So I guess that my question is, how do you see what is happening today in terms of, the social reactions? And if you had to just explore a little bit the idea of what is the opposite of policing, what human quality is the opposite of policing, what would that be?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the development of the police abolitionist debates is that, in the context of where they have a lot of their original drive in the States, it was heavily driven by the question of race. And that one could see that for obvious reasons with all of those various cases of police killings. But I do think it's important not to reduce the problem of policing to the problem of race, right? Clearly there is a problem of police racism, but the extent of that problem varies from nation to nation. And if we only view policing through the lens of race, then I think we're going to have a very limited kind of analysis, right? Again, this goes back to questions of abstraction. If you want a general theory of police power, a critical theory of police power, it needs to speak to different national contexts. So, for example, I don't think you're going to make much mileage into understanding police power in the development of capitalism in Russia now through the lens of race, right? It's just not going to work. And then you can take a different example, such as Turkey, right? It's not going to help you a great deal, right? Just looking at policing through race. So firstly, I'd want to say, look, we need to hold on to the idea of a critical theory of police power, that it doesn't reduce it to race. The other thing is, I don't know how much coverage British policing gets in Mexico, but I think it might be worth, if you're setting out on kind of critical police studies, right, what's taking place in the UK at the moment is quite interesting, because police brutality, police violence, yes, there's a racial dimension and there's a long-standing class dimension, but the thing that's really put it on the agenda in the last few years is actually sex, is gender. It's to do with not minorities, like you said, yeah, but is it to do with actually half of the population? In fact, slightly more than half the population. In other words, it's to do with how police operate in relation to women, right? So there have been police killings of women, right, by off-duty police officers, I'm talking about, yeah. And what has become clear out of that is the nature in which gender is policed violently, aggressively, to the point where, the major struggles to try and delimit police powers in Britain at the moment are taking place through the lens of gender. Now, that shouldn't surprise us, because I don't know if you know this book by Marcus Dubber on the police power, but he makes the point that, we need to understand the police historically as a deeply patriarchal institution, right? And that patriarchal nature of policing took it took various forms historically, to do with the policing of dress, to do with the policing of the streets, to do with the policing of prostitution, to do with the policing of domestic violence. But right now it's come to the fore in the literal sense of, police violence against women. Yeah. So I think, if you were doing a kind of study over the next few weeks in critical policing, it'd be worth paying attention to that dynamic. You asked, you've saved your best question for last, Alejandro, didn't you? Right, which is, what's the opposite of policing, right? And and I said earlier, well, we might want to think about security abolition, and you're putting me on the spot, right? Because we're confronted with a reality which we are told is normal and natural, right? it's normal and natural that police forces exist. It's normal and natural that we express and feel forms of insecurity. It's normal and natural that we look for security solutions to all of our various insecurities. It's normal and natural that we look to the police to provide the very basics of that security, right? And so if you argue against police power, if you argue for security abolition as well as police abolition, the question you're going to get is the very one that you've just asked, right? Which is, you know, well, what's the opposite? What? And the answer is, I don't have an answer, right? Because we're talking about, you know, a social formation that is so fundamentally different to the one we're in that we haven't forged the concepts for it yet, okay? But it may be that we can start thinking about things such as, well, you know, something like solidarity, right? Or, for example, I think Pablo a little while ago talked about care, right? You know, there's a lot of interest now in philosophies of care, right? What would it mean to try and develop forms of care outside of institutions of policing, not just the police force, but also those institutions that tell us that they care for us, but actually don't, right? You know, the social workers, the welfare officers, and so forth. You know, what would it mean to develop forms of solidarity that cannot be appropriated by the state and its security apparatus, right? I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's the kind of struggles we should be trying to involve ourselves in and trying to pursue, right? Because we're always going to be confronted with, you know, the state and its police apparatus, its security apparatuses, trying to appropriate everything we do, right? To turn it into a form of political administration, right? That has been our loss, our biggest loss over the last half a century or so, right? Which is every kind of struggle we engage in gets appropriated and turned into a form of political administration and is used to police us, right?
Thank you, Mark, so much for all of you've discussed today, all the doors that you open to start thinking about these topics critically. Thank you so much, Alejandro, for organizing this talk, and also for being here, for your questions. And also, I will say this in Spanish, también agradecer mucho a Alejandro que haya organizado esta charla, y que también decir que hay un seminario que el propio Alejandro Lerch va a dar en breve a través de 17 Instituto de Estudios Críticos sobre estudios críticos de la seguridad. Entonces, bueno, este evento de alguna manera inicia, ¿verdad? Abre la conversación que luego se podrá tener en el seminario. Pueden ver la información en la página 17 y también inscribirse, todavía están a tiempo. Thank you so much, both you, Mark, and Alejandro. I know you want to say one last thing, Alejandro. We're over the time limit, but I will leave you with the last word.
Oh, just to thank Mark. Mark, thank you so much for having accepted to talk to us. It's just like so fascinating, and your work really opened so many avenues to rethink security, to rethink police, and that is why you're one of the most influential, you know, theorists right now in this field. So we're honored, and thank you.
Listen, the pleasure was mine, all mine. I appreciate the invitation. I'm very sorry that we had to speak in English, but it wouldn't have made any sense otherwise. And listen, good luck with the critical policing studies, right? I hope you have some fun with it.
Thank you. I'm going to add on the Facebook, on the YouTube video, I'm going to add some links to Mark's work for people who might be interested in taking a look. And as you know, you're entitled to download this, these products through whatever means possible, within or without the scope of policing. So thank you so much to everyone.
Take care.
Gracias.